I have long maintained that the Sony 85mm f1.4 G Master line has always delivered some of the sharpest photos with some of the creamiest bokeh in the Sony lens lineup, but it's always tough looking at that G Master price, to the point where I'd only recommend the lenses to you if you were a die-hard hobbyist who loved taking portraits or portrait photography was a part of your business. But then comes this 𝗚𝗔𝗣𝗥𝗦 beauty, the Viltrox 85mm f1.4 Pro lens for full-frame cameras, delivering 95% of the sharp and creamy results, but at only 30.69% of the price. Today's showcase of this lens is indeed sponsored by Viltrox, but after looking at some of the results I've gotten, I think you'll be just as surprised as I was with the results. Let's go ahead and kick things off with a little sample video shot with this lens. Alright, first let's take a look at this new lens we have here, and the first thing I have to say is, in the hands, it kind of reminds me of some vintage lenses I've used. I mean, take a look at that beautiful, massive piece of glass on the front. The lens housing is all metal and overall is a hefty lens that's kind of built like a tank. The optics are constructed of 15 elements, including coatings to create the clean images that come out of this lens. On the front of the lens, you'll find a 77mm filter thread. On the mount of the lens, you'll find a weather sealing gasket and that standard Viltrox USB-C port for firmware updates to help future-proof this lens. On the body of the lens, you'll find a focus-by-wire autofocus ring and an aperture ring that goes from f1.4 up to f16, which you can operate in the manual mode or switch it to auto for electronic control. You can, of course, choose click or declick with a switch, and we've got a focus mode switch along with a custom programmable button on the side here. Basically, all of the accoutrements that you come to expect from a professional lens. And like really quite comparable to the Sony 85mm f1.4 G Master Mark II minus one programmable button. So I said that this lens is super sharp, and I'm even out here comparing it to Sony's gold standard of that G Master Mark II, and I'm not kidding. Comparing these lenses, the Viltrox performs remarkably well when it comes to corner-to-corner sharpness. I think the G Master might be a hair sharper at some apertures, but overall, if you're not pixel peeping, the Viltrox lens definitely delivers some really beautiful images with incredible sharpness that's becoming more and more common these days with higher end but still budget-friendly third-party lenses. Now, some of the things the test chart does show me is that out of the camera, yes, I'm definitely noticing some more vignetting in the Viltrox lens, and there's some more noticeable barrel distortion, but this is, of course, comparing it to the Sony lens, which has the advantage of in-body distortion correction. Still, Sony technically has the edge here, but a lens profile and a slider adjustment in Lightroom can easily address the issue if you're just shooting stills. Another quick note is that some chromatic aberration is definitely noticeable in these test chart photos, but as I'll show in more sample photos, it's not very noticeable in real-world scenarios. Now, what about the bokeh? Well, you decide. Personally, I think the bokeh is very lovely, with the bokeh balls creating a cat eye swirl towards the center of the frame. Wide open, you're not really going to get super circular bokeh, definitely giving this lens a distinctive characteristic. Overall, to me, it has a dreamy, almost vintage look, but still clean and legible. Okay, here comes the tough part. Autofocus. This is where first-party lenses will always have the advantage. If you're planning on shooting something like basketball while you're courtside tracking fast-moving subjects, I'm probably always going to recommend Sony first-party lenses for that scenario. I mean, Sony gets to make the autofocus software and the hardware focus system. Yeah, they're gonna have that advantage. But I use this lens to shoot portraits, and usually my subjects aren't moving that fast. I can plan out my shot, and for that, it does the job 99% of the time perfectly. Eye tracking works remarkably well, and getting in-focus shots really wasn't much of a concern when shooting with this lens. I think during one of my client shoots, we were dealing with a really harsh backlighting scenario that kind of threw the lens off and made it miss focus by like a hair for a burst of 3 photos. If anything, it kind of reminded me of shooting on the original Sony 85mm f1.4 G Master, you know, the Mark I, because that lens definitely was a little bit sluggish when it came to autofocus. especially for shooting videos. And speaking of shooting videos, I did a few of these incredibly exciting video focus tests at 120 frames per second, and when playing it back at full speed, it tracks extremely smoothly. Once I slowed it down to 25% playback speed, if you look really closely, that's when you can see it kind of stepping to focus to the next focus point, but even then, for it being wide open at f1.4 with that shallow of depth, that is not bad. Oh, and like, check this out. Normally with third-party lenses, I'm always concerned with the autofocus motors they use because sometimes they can be kind of loud, but this one is like silent. Check this out. I genuinely can barely hear a thing. And speaking of videos and focus breathing. The focus breathing on this lens isn't too bad either. It's not non-existent, but it's also at a level that's not distracting either, making this all around a pretty versatile lens for both stills and video work. Here's a quick pro tip: no matter what third-party lenses you're using, always kind of make sure to check for this. If you're using a third-party lens on a Sony camera, double check to make sure that your stabilization settings are correct. Go into the stabilization settings and manually set the focal length, because for some reason, and I don't know if this is a Sony problem or if it's just third-party lens companies specifically that maybe they're not doing something correctly, but sometimes the auto detect of the focal length of the lens is wrong, and then you get weird stabilization. So whenever I use third-party lenses, I always like to make sure that the stabilization is correct by manually setting that focal length. So there's your quick reminder. I'm gonna say this in every single video where I talk about a third-party lens. Okay, now let's talk about the lens flare performance on this lens. Head on, the lens flares create a mild amount of bloom with some ghosting artifacts, but overall are well suppressed. With a lot of light coming in, you are gonna lose some contrast. When you do get really intense off-angle lighting hitting the lens though, you can end up creating these saturated flare elements like these that you're seeing on screen, which you may or may not like, but I actually ended up trying to replicate this just to add in some fun variation during one of my recent portrait sessions. Of course, you can mostly avoid this by just using the lens hood. And again, the thing to me that makes this lens so compelling is the fact that it can do all of this at a price point of under $600. And if you're interested in checking out this lens for yourself, I'll leave links in the description down below. Putting this lens to use over the past month has made me really appreciate the current state that the camera gear space is in. Third-party brands like Viltrox have really been releasing some incredibly compelling lenses, ranging from the super budget-friendly options to competing in the pro end of the market, from value-centric offerings like their 16mm f1.8 to their killer 135mm f1.4 lab to their incredibly tempting 35mm f1.4 lab, which I don't own yet, but I really want to get my hands on, to now this 85mm f1.4 Pro. I just love that there's an option for just about every price point. And I don't mean from just Viltrox. Like, for example, I recently just picked up a 7 Artisan's 24mm f1.8 to see how well it compares against my OG Sony 24mm f1.4 G Master, which is gonna be a fun video coming soonish. And then there's companies like Laowa with their crazy freaking cool 10mm f2.8 lens. Like, it's options galore. But I'm getting sidetracked here. Today, we're talking about the 85mm lens, and personally, I think that the sample photos and the sample videos kind of speak for themselves, but I am really curious to know what you think. If you didn't have an 85mm lens right now, which 85mm would you pick up? Would it be the Viltrox 85 f1.4 that we have today? Would it be the Sony G Master Mark II? Or would it be a 85 from another brand? Let me know in the comment section down below. All right, that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, make sure to hit that like button and get subscribed. We have some really fun content coming up. Annette and I are actually gonna be in Switzerland in about a few weeks' time, and we have some really fun videos planned while we're there. So make sure to get subscribed so you don't miss out on that. And as always, I will see you in the next one. Peace.